bricks. Last video we had the earthquake hit while they were in an abandoned saloon, an abandoned building. The chimney of the building came crashing down and almost buried Morris and Leo underneath it, but Morris got Leo out. Fletch, the bully, ran away. But what about Wilkie? What happened to him? You remember? Yeah, he got buried under the bricks, and luckily two beams went across him and stopped the bricks from smashing him. But it was hard for Leo and Morris to move the beams. But Wilkie got out. The neighborhood that they were in is on fire, like some houses, and probably get going more. And Wilkie was very upset with Fletch because he's followed Fletch forever, and Fletch just left him. So Morris and Leo said, "You can stay with us, come with us." And he said, "We're going to get your gold back." And Wilkie said he knows where Fletch went. So let's find out how this story ends. Oh, and this, I told you I'd tell you what this is. This is actually a picture from the San Francisco earthquake, 1906 earthquake. This is the City Hall in San Francisco after the earthquake. If you can see it, it's completely destroyed, as it was half of the city. So, but imagine that's what it looked like where they were. Chapter 10. Wilkie led them back towards Market Street. Wilkie was sure Flex had gone back to the abandoned house where they stashed their loot. That way, if the police got us, he explained, they wouldn't find us. They zigzagged through the crowds of people. Most of them were heading away from where Wilkie was taking them, and no wonder. The damage was worse than the further south they walked. One boarding house was split in half. Another had been swallowed by the earth almost to the rooftop. Trolley tracks were twisted like pretzels. On one block, men were trying to hoist a horse out of a hole in the street. Leo tried not to look at the collapsed buildings, but he couldn't stop thinking about who might still be inside. The fires were worse down here. With every step, the smoke was thicker, the air hotter. Leo's lungs started to ache. They were about to cross Market Street when a fire wagon clattered up and stopped in front of them. The two huge horses pulling the wagon wheezed and snorted. Sweat soaked their bodies. Two firefighters jumped off, dragging a thick hose. They hooked it up to a hydrant, but only a trickle of water came out. A man in a blood-stained shirt rushed up to the fireman. "Please help me," he begged. "Everything I own is in my house, and the fire is moving towards it." So there are the firemen coming to fight the fire. He pointed across the street where the roof of one house was on fire. Next door, men were leading horses out of the stable. "I'm sorry, sir," said the taller of the firemen. "The quake broke our water mains. We've been up and down Market. We can't find any water to fight the fires." "You're going to let the city burn?" the man exclaimed. The firemen said nothing, but their eyes, weary and scared, told the answer. San Francisco was burning, and nobody could stop it. The firemen rolled up their hoses and climbed into their wagon and continued down the street. Leo knew they should get out of here. Morris was right, but suddenly Morris gasped. "It's Fletch," he cried, pointing across the street. Leo saw him. He was carrying a small, tattered flour sack. "Fletch!" shouted Wilkie. His voice boomed through the smoky air. Fletch turned, took one look at Wilkie, and bolted down the alley next to the burning house. To Leo's amazement, it wasn't Wilkie who took off first after Fletch. It was Morris. They both disappeared into the alley. Leo and Wilkie started after them, but they had just barely crossed the street when the ground jolted with another aftershock. People screamed and ran into the street. There was a deep cracking noise right above them. A piece of rooftop from the burning house crashed onto the sidewalk. Garbage on the ground erupted in flames. The alley was now blocked by a wall of fire. Well, aftershocks are still happening. They usually do happen for a while after an earthquake. So the city's burning, and the firemen can't fight it because, what did they say? What happened? Because all their water mains broke. If they don't have water, you can't fight the fire. And the guy asked if they're just going to let the city burn, and they didn't answer. They just kind of had a weary, scared look on their face. But who did Wilkie see going down the street? Fletch. When Fletch, he yelled at him, and Fletch turned and saw who it was. What did he do? Was he happy to see him? No, he ran away. He was scared. And who took off after him? The first person to take off running. Shockingly, it was Morris. Fletch took off running after Fletch, and Wilkie and Leo came up behind. Fletch and Morris took off down an alley. Why couldn't Leo and Wilkie go after him? Because during the aftershock, part of the roof came off the house, caught stuff on the ground on fire, and there was a wall of fire between them and the alley. All right. Chapter 11. Leo stepped towards the alley. Wilkie grabbed him by the back of the shirt. No, he said. There's no way out of there. What do you mean? That alley doesn't cut through, he said. How do you know? Leo said. I know every alley in this town. That one is useless. But Leo had to do something. He couldn't let Morris die in that alley. How could he help? Leo searched his mind for ideas, and as usual, his thoughts turned to Grandpop. He remembered that terrifying story of the forest fires in the Sierras. He'd only heard it a few times, but he remembered every detail. Grandpop had finally crossed into California, and in just a few more days he'd be in gold country. He left his horse and wagon at a trading post. He headed up into the woods to hunt for rabbits. He would need their skins to trade for gold mining tools. It had been a hot and dry summer. Everywhere he looked there were dying trees, their leaves brown and papery. Dead grass and weeds crunched under Grandpop's boots. There was hardly a speck of green anywhere. Grandpop roamed the woods. He bagged a few rabbits, and then clouds rolled in. Grandpop had smiled at the sky. A cool rain was just what he needed, but only a few raindrops fell. Meanwhile, lightning slashed through the sky, and then kaboom! A lightning bolt struck a dead tree, turning into a burning torch. More lightning bolts shot out of the clouds, stabbing the ground like burning spears. Soon, there were fires everywhere. A powerful wind fanned the flames. Within just a few minutes, Grandpop was stuck in the middle of a ring of fire. The heat was so strong that the metal on his belt started to melt. Grandpop had no idea what to do. He got down on his hands and knees. Down low, the smoke wasn't as thick. He could see where he was going. He almost didn't see the stream until he'd crawled into it. It was practically dry, just a few inches of water covering the muddy bottom, but there was enough so that Grandpop could lie down and soak his clothes. He took his handkerchief and drenched it in water. He put the soaking handkerchief over his head, filled his lung with air, and dashed through the flames. Seconds later, when he came out of the other side, his pants and back of his coat were on fire. He rolled in the dirt and put them out. Then he ran for his life. When he staggered back into the trading post, nobody recognized him. His beard and eyebrows were singed off. His face was black with ash. His fingers blistered red. Once again, his quick thinking and calm head had saved him. I need to find some water, Leo said to Wilkie now. You heard those firemen, Wilkie said. They can't even find any. Leo thought for a minute. He remembered the men leading the horses out of the stable. Where there were horses, he thought, there had to be water. Wilkie followed Leo, and they dashed into the stable. Sure enough, there was a trough filled with dirty water. There was also a blanket. Wilkie watched as Leo climbed into the trough of water and soaked himself from head to toe, and then he soaked the blanket so it was dripping wet. What are you doing? Wilkie said. This is going to protect me, Leo said out of breath, when I run into the alley. You can't go in there, Wilkie said. Just a little bit of water isn't going to do anything. I'll make it, Leo said. I'll make it. He repeated those words in his mind, trying to believe them. As he ran back outside at the entrance of the alley, Leo put the blanket around his body and over his head. And then Wilkie grabbed him again. Let go, Leo shouted. They had no time to waste. Wilkie wasn't trying to stop him. I'm going with you, he said. Leo opened his mouth to tell Wilkie no, to tell him to stay where he was, but there was no time to argue, and from the look in Wilkie's eyes, he understood that there was no stopping Wilkie. They were in this together. Leo had to stand on his tiptoes to get the blanket around Wilkie. Make sure your face is covered, Leo told him. On the count of 3, take a deep breath, run as fast as you can. Leo filled his lungs and put the blanket over his head. 1, 2, 3. Leo and Wilkie rushed into the fire. Alright, so that chapter, we once again heard another Grandpop survival story. Grandpop's a pretty good survival. He keeps a calm head most of the time. This time it was a forest fire. What caused that forest fire? lightning. It was a really dry year. Trees were all dried up. Lightning hit a tree. Poof, you have a forest fire. How did he survive it? He crawled to a creek that there was a little bit of water left, and soaked his handkerchief, put over his head, and ran through it. He did catch on fire a little bit, but he did the stop, drop, and roll, and put it out. So how did that work into Leo's favor? Well, after thinking about it, he realized that there was a horse barn stable. So there had to be water there. So he went there, and in there was tons of water. He soaked himself in a blanket and put it around him, and he was getting ready to run in. But Wilkie stopped him. Why did Wilkie stop him? Because he said he was going to go with him. Yeah. That's our friends. So let's see how this goes. Chapter 12. Their leap through the flames took just seconds, but Leo knew for as long as he lived, he would never forget the feeling of that scorching heat. The fire seemed to pull at the blanket like a beast hungry for Leo's flesh. When they came out, Wilkie's pant leg was on fire. "Look out," Leo called. Leo grabbed the blanket and patted out the flames. They looked at each other in shock. They made it, but still, the smoke was thick, and it hurt to breathe. "Do you see him?" Leo shouted. "I can barely see anything," Wilkie said. Leo remembered Grandpa crawling through the brush looking for the stream. "Get down," Leo said, dropping to his knees. The air was clearer closer to the ground, but the heat was searing. The wall of fire roared behind them. People shouted from the street, "Get out, it's all burning, it's too late." They had just minutes or two to find Morris and get out, Leo knew. Bits of glass from shattered windows cut into Leo's hands and knees as he crawled. His heart pounded with fear. He felt dizzy from the smoke. He and Wilkie screamed Morris's name. But with the shouting of the crowd and the roaring of the fire, it was almost impossible to hear anything, until finally they heard a voice. "Leo, over here!" The voice was weak. Leo moved forward, and then in his heart gave a wild jump. All he could see was Morris's head on the ground. Only his head. His body was gone. Wilkie came up behind Leo and gasped, "What the?" Leo had also jumped up and ran in horror. But then he understood. Morris's head hadn't been cut off. It had fallen into some kind of hole. Only his head and one arm was sticking out. "I'm stuck," Morris said. "I can't breathe." Wilkie rushed over and grabbed Morris's arm with both of his hands and gave a mighty tug, but Morris barely budged. "It's tight in here," Morris said. "Go slow." Inch by inch, Wilkie pulled Morris from the earth like a farmer pulling a gigantic carrot from his garden. With each second that passed, the crackling roar of the fire grew louder. Sweat poured off of Leo's body. Wilkie finally got Morris out of the hole. Leo grabbed hold of Morris, who wobbled on his feet. He held on to Morris even after Morris was steady. "I'm okay," Morris said. "We need to get out." Morris pointed to an open window just above a heap of garbage. "That way," he said. "That's how Fletch got out. He knew I was stuck. I kept calling him, but he just kept going." Anger rose up in Leo, but there was no time to think about Fletch now. They all climbed up the heap of garbage. Wilkie got to the top first. He clambered through the window and then reached out to help Morris and Leo get in. They were in somebody's bedroom. A dresser had smashed down on top of the bed. It looked like it had dropped through a giant hole in the ceiling. Luckily, it seemed that the person who lived here had escaped. The heat was very strong, and Leo was sure that some of the rooms of this building were burning. He prayed that they could make it down in time before the fire reached them or the building collapsed on top of them. They found the stairs and began to make their way down. They walked lightly, but with each step the stairway swayed. The wood groaned and creaked. One small aftershock and his whole place would tumble to the ground. Wilkie suddenly stopped short. "Hurry, Wilkie," Leo said. But then he saw it. A body was laying on the floor. At first he thought it was the person who lived here. But then came a rasping voice. "Wilkie," the body groaned. It was Fletch. Alright, so did they find Morris? Yes, they heard a voice, they went, and it was Morris. But there was only one thing there. What was it? They saw his head, but no no body. So they freaked out a little bit. But then they realized, what was it really? It really was just him stuck in a hole. So they had to work slowly to get him out, but they got him out. And he pointed which way Fletch went, which was through a house. When they got into the house, they saw a body laying on the floor. Who was it? It was Fletch. But he was talking, so he's not dead. He's just injured somehow. Chapter 13. Fletch looked at Wilkie with a sweet smile painted on his face. I knew you'd find me, old pal. I knew it. I was sitting here praying, and here you are. Fletch was clutching that white flour sack. Here, he said, holding it out to Wilkie. See? I saved it for you. I was going to come look for you. I swear I was. Sure you were, Fletch. Wilkie said in said in a weak voice. I know you didn't forget about me. Leo and Morris looked at each other, unsure of what was happening. Did Wilkie really believe Fletch's lies? Was he going to join back up with him? Come on, Fletch rasped. We can share with your new buddies too, if that's what you want. Whatever you say, pal. Whatever you say. I'll take care of you, Fletch, Wilkie said. His voice didn't sound weak anymore. Of course you will, Fletch said. We're a team, you and me. We take care of each other. Wilkie snatched a flour sack from Fletch and handed it to Leo. Your gold is in there, he said. Take it. Sure, Fletch said. Sure thing. Let the kid have his gold back. We're all friends now. Leo rummaged through the sack. It was filled with money, bills and coins, watches and wallets. He found his gold nugget. It felt warm as though it had been in Papa's hand. Just moments before, he handed the flour sack back to Wilkie. Wilkie stepped back and stared at Fletch. You left me for dead, Wilkie said. No, Fletch cried. I was coming back for you. That's where I was heading. I swear it. Leo could see the rage on Wilkie's face. It was as though the heat and fury of the fire had taken control of him. Wilkie grabbed a splintered piece of wood. He raised it up so far over Fletch's head. Leo and Morris both leaped forward. No, Wilkie, they both shouted. They each grabbed one of Wilkie's massive arms. Wilkie shook them off just like they were butterflies. He glared at Fletch. He was set to smash that wood over Fletch's head. But Morris moved so that he was in between Fletch and Wilkie. We don't have time for this, Morris said in his matter-of-fact voice. We have to go. Leo stood frozen, afraid that Wilkie might hurt Morris. Then what would happen? But somehow Morris could always get people to pay attention, whether they wanted to or not. Leo reached up and took hold of the wood. Wilkie had held it tight, but finally he let Leo take it. Wilkie grabbed Fletch roughly by the arm and stood him up. Fletch cried out in pain. Leo could see that his leg was horribly twisted. He needed to get to a hospital. Wilkie didn't care. He dragged Fletch, yelling and limping, out onto the street and tossed him on the sidewalk. There were 2 policemen just up the street. Maybe they'll help you, Wilkie said. Then he spit on the ground and stormed away. Leo and Morris hurried after him. None of them looked back at Fletch. But they could hear his rasping cries echoing behind him. They walked just a few blocks when they passed a woman standing in front of a ruined burning house. Her 4 little children were gathered around her, their clothing tattered and covered with ash. The woman was sobbing to a soldier. I've lost everything, she wailed. My husband, my house, everything. What will we do? What will become of me and my children? The soldier patted the woman's arm but then moved on. Wilkie stopped short. He went to the woman without a word and handed her the flour sack. Then he turned and hurried back to Leo and Morris. Leo could see that Wilkie's face had changed. The blazing look was gone. A peaceful look had come over him. He didn't look back at the woman, but Leo did. He watched her open the bag and look in. Leo knew he'd never forget the look of amazement on her face. With every hour as they walked, they heard of new fires, new neighborhoods destroyed, all of the streets south of Market, Rincon Hill, and downtown, Chinatown. City Hall was gone. City Hall. So was the library with its 1 million books. Morris got tears in his eyes when he heard that. Hundreds of little fires had joined together into a huge firestorm that raced through the city. No neighborhood was safe, and so they just kept walking. Leo had never been so tired or thirsty. His entire body ached, his eyes burned, and he had cuts all over his hands. He had no idea where they'd end up, but he was still in one piece. That was something. He had his gold nugget back, and he had a feeling inside, one he hadn't felt since Papa was still alive. Walking between Wilkie and Morris, his shoulder brushing theirs, he knew in his heart that he wasn't alone. Alright, so that's the end of that chapter. They stopped Wilkie from destroying Fletch, which he really wanted to. But Fletch was injured, so what did they do with him? Wilkie dragged him out into the street, dropped him there where there was 2 police officers down the street and said, hopefully they'll help you, and walked away. They did get the gold back. And they had the flour sack, which was filled with coins and money and stuff. What did Wilkie do with that? Because he took it from Fletch, gave it to Leo, and Leo gave it back to him after he got his gold nugget. So what did he do with it? They came across a woman on the street who was crying to a soldier that she had lost everything. Her husband, her house, everything. What she's supposed to do. So Wilkie just walked over, handed it to her, and walked away. She looked into it, and she was, like, amazed. But that was nice of him. And then at the end, they were walking away. They were walking across the city, because the whole city was destroyed. I mean, right there. And he felt like he wasn't alone. He had 2 people, 2 friends. Alright, so we're going to do the last chapter. Chapter 14, April 21st, 1906, Sacramento, California. Leo stood on the train platform at the Sacramento station. The sun shone brightly in the clear blue sky. Beside him, Morris had his face turned up, enjoying the fresh, clear air. All around them were refugees from San Francisco. They were all different kinds of people. Fancy ladies and street kids, Chinese families and scruffy gamblers, businessmen and very old people. Coats and hats were covered with ash and dust. Some people wore bandages or walked with crutches, and they all shared the same expression, a mixture of shock and relief. Their city was gone. Thousands were dead, but they had escaped, alive. They'd all gotten to the California capital just that morning. Leo, Morris, Wilkie, and thousands of strangers. The Southern Pacific Railroad had given out 1 free ticket to anyone who wanted to leave San Francisco. After spending 3 miserable days in Golden Gate Park, the boys all wanted to get as far away from San Francisco as they could. The park had been turned into a tent city. Soldiers handed out food and water, but there wasn't enough for everyone. Leo and the guys had waited in line all day just to get a piece of bread and some water. Sleeping was impossible, with all the crying and screaming. The fires had finally gone out on the 4th morning after the earthquake, but smoke and ash still filled the sky. Every breath reminded Leo of what had happened. Some people in the tent city were already talking about rebuilding. A preacher had stood in front of a crowd, calling on the crowd not to give up on San Francisco. Our city is gone, he said, but its spirit is here. We will rebuild. Leo believed it. Grandpop had helped build this city the first time, when it had been turned from a bunch of shacks into the mud into one of the most beautiful cities in the world. But Leo knew that he needed to put the ruins and smoke behind him. Even before the quake, he had been looking for a fresh start. Wilkie and Morris needed one too. They left Golden Gate Park and walked for 3 hours through the smoldering ruins to get to the train station. They crowded onto the first train they could. 5 hours later, they were breathing in clear air, gazing up at the buildings that stood strong and tall. The earth was still. They figured they'd stay in Sacramento. They'd sell newspapers, they'd share a room, they'd get by. But over the past few hours, their plan had changed. That morning, the 3 of them had gone to a bank. Within the hour, Leo had sold his gold nugget. It's what Grandpop would have done, he was sure. And what Papa would have wanted Leo to do. He had enough money to buy Wilkie a train ticket to Seattle. Wilkie was going to find that man who wanted to turn him into a football star. Why don't you guys come with me, Wilkie had said. You could play too. We could all be on the same team. We already are, Morris said in that wise voice of his. They all smiled. There was some team, the 3 of them. Leo had an idea that they always would be, no matter where life took them. But Leo and Morris weren't going with Wilkie. They had a plan of their own. Leo had bought 2 tickets to New York City. He and Morris would find Morris's cousins. They would start new lives there. It was a crazy idea, Leo knew, but no crazier than when Grandpop had left New Hampshire to make his fortune in gold country. Wilkie took a long look at them before he got on the train, like he was painting the picture in his mind. I will see you again, he said. He stuck out his hand, and Leo and Morris put their hands on top of his. Their fingers were cut up, black with ash and grime, scraped raw in spots, but their hands looked strong, especially all put all together. The train whistle blew, and then just as when he gave that sack of loot to the crying lady, Wilkie turned and hurried off without another word. Leo and Morris stood in silence, watching Wilkie's train disappear. They bought themselves some cold bottles of milk and warm rolls, and then there was nothing to do but wait for their own train. Leo felt in his pocket where the gold nugget used to be. "Do you miss your gold?" Morris asked quietly. "No, I don't," Leo said. The words came quickly, and Leo was surprised to hear them. But no, he didn't miss it. He was taking Leo and Morris where they needed to go, and Papa had always given him other treasures, he realized. Priceless treasures. All those stories about Grandpa and the belief Leo had in his own luck and courage, that came from Papa too. A faith stronger and shinier than gold. And now, as he waited for the train, Leo heard Papa's words brighter and clearer than ever. Something remarkable was going to happen to him. He could feel it. And that is the end of our story. Kind of an interesting story if you think about it, right? So, they survived. They got out of San Francisco. How did they get train tickets to go to the two places? One to New Hampshire, or two to New Hampshire, one to Seattle. Leo sold his cold nugget, but he felt that it was the right thing to do. Hope you enjoyed this story. I'll be back with another video to kind of finish it up, where we're going to learn a little bit about earthquakes. And so I'll see you then.